The exposure metering process is handled differently by different cameras. So we'll take a look at some of the different methods that cameras use to determine proper exposure. Full frame is the old method. This is the method that cameras used back in the 1980s when there really wasn't any means by which the camera could electronically determine any difference between one part of the frame from another. And these cameras would basically just take a look at all the light that came through a particular lens and hit the light meter and would just give you an exposure reading based upon all the light that came through the camera. As a result, many of these cameras delivered improper exposure, and there was a lot of mistakes that were made when it came to exposure with these cameras. And as a result, a lot of frustration as well, because back in those days, we're talking about film and people didn't have an LCD on the back of their camera to see what they were getting. Well, as cameras evolved and light meters matured, we got an evaluative metering process, which is what most cameras use today. We'll take a more in-depth look at that in just a moment, but there are also other methods that your camera can probably switch to, such as partial or spot or center weighted. So we'll take a brief look at those as well. So for this live demo on exposure, I've got 3 items set up in front of the camera that represent different levels of exposure for different subjects. And as usual, I've got my camera tethered to my laptop here that is all set to remote control it, but once again, just uses the same controls that you have in your standard SLR camera. All right, so as I look through this frame, I've got a middle gray subject, I've got a pure white subject over here on the left, and a very dark subject on the right there, perhaps pure black. As I move this cursor around the frame, I'm able to choose different metering sections within the frame itself. Now, many cameras have what's called a spot metering system, which allows you to limit the area of exposure from the entire frame that you're looking at to just a very small section. And in some situations, it's useful to use that. However, this demo is not just to talk about spot metering, but just to talk about metering in general. When you have an evaluative metering process, which most cameras do, they're taking into consideration the entire frame. And they might, for example, favor items that are located in the middle of the frame more than items located at the edges of the frame. And then they might take a look at different sections, divide it all up and chop it up in little bits, and then say, okay, well, these sections have priority over these sections. But however the metering system is set up and however you've chosen to customize your camera, there's always the possibility that in a certain situation, the camera is going to think differently than you are in terms of your subject. The evaluative metering process relies on a zone system, and this is an image of Canon 16 zone metering system. There are lots of others out there, and there are different names for these as well, and different manufacturers may not call it an evaluative metering process, but they'll have something that represents the similar process. When you look at these rectangles, you'll notice there are different sizes as you go through the frame, and it's assumed that the edges and the far perimeter of the frame are going to be less important than the areas in the middle of the frame or towards the center areas. So you notice those larger rectangles at the corners are probably going to be less important in the metering process than the smaller ones are. But when it comes to those smaller rectangles, again, the camera has to make a decision as to how to weight these. Which of those rectangles should be given priority over the others? And that's where the autofocus system comes into play. And now with today's advanced camera autofocus systems, they have different levels of ability to pinpoint different areas within the frame so that they can focus on different portions of the frame, and then that would feed into the metering process. So for example, if a subject was on the left of the frame or the right of the frame, the autofocus system would know that, would lock in on that subject, and based upon the camera user's pressing of the shutter release button, the camera knows that the autofocus must have picked up on the right subject. If the user doesn't press the shutter release, then they're going to look somewhere else. They're going to take their finger off the button and then try again. So whatever happens to be the point of autofocus is going to get the weighting when it comes to the metering process. So maybe, for example, in this situation, we know that our subject is the black bear. Okay, we know that it's very dark and it's going to have a different exposure setting than the other items, but the camera doesn't. The camera just says, well, I've got all these items in, and I'm going to compare and contrast all these different sections of the frame, and I'm just going to make a decision for exposure based upon everything. As a result, you might get something that looks like this, where the exposure on the black bear is quite dark, the exposure on the light chick is too light, but the exposure for the middle gray elephant is perfect. Now, if I take this rectangle over and I place it on top of the bear, you may notice that there's been a change already in the exposure rating. So now it's exposing more for the bear. And if I zoom in, you'll see this better. Let me just zoom in and refocus on the fur there. Okay. Let me just move over so I've got just nothing but the black fur. Okay, so there you can see on the black fur, all the fibers are present. All the detail and the texture is there in spite of how dark this surface is. It's exposing correctly now for the bear itself. But now if I zoom out, you'll notice that the white chick is completely whitewashed, completely gone. There's no detail there in the texture whatsoever. In fact, you really can't even see any difference between the exposure, the exposed area here and the background, the white background. The middle gray elephant is too light, but I can still see texture there. Okay, so the elephant is still within the realm of exposure here. But notice the black bear, all the detail is there, all the detail in the fur. The black bear looks correctly exposed. And this is something that we might expect if we're using a spot metering system and we focused that spot directly on the bear, took a meter reading off the bear, and then recomposed the photograph to take all three into account. So if the subject was the bear, maybe that's the way to go. Now, if we were to then put the attention back on the elephant, we're getting more of a middle-of-the-road exposure. We're getting something closer to what we'd have in an evaluative metering process where everything is probably compared and contrasted, and we come up with sort of an average. Well, middle gray is often where we like to be. It's often closest to the flesh tones of humans that we're trying to shoot, but not necessarily. It's often closest towards, to the overall exposure that's going to satisfy all the subjects. But again, many situations arise where we're going to have subjects that don't fill the frame, subjects that aren't readily apparent to the metering system that that's the correct exposure. So in this situation, I've got a little bit of detail lacking in both the bear and the chick, but the elephant is correctly exposed. So this is what it would look like if you were to take an image of a subject that was slightly to the left of center. Then you can see there in the first example, the red rectangle would represent the point of focus. That would represent the center of the subject. And then the white areas represent the fall-off region, or the areas that surround the subject. Now, of course, those white regions might also include the subject itself, but that would be fine as far as the meters considered. It would average those areas together and take a meter reading that is slanted or biased towards that particular area of the frame. The blue areas would then take a subordinate position when it comes to the overall metering, but they could be factored in as well. The exact percentages that each of these rectangles would represent could vary by manufacturer and by make and model of camera, and oftentimes they don't release that level of specific information anyway, but we can just assume that the camera is using particular regions based upon the autofocus to better determine the correct exposure. And this is in large part has resulted in superior image taking when it comes to exposure and a lot less mistakes on the part of in-camera metering systems. Two other methods that you might come across, partial and center weighted, are very similar. Both of these use the center rectangle as the most dominant area of the frame to determine exposure. And the difference between these methods and spot metering systems is that a spot metering system uses only the middle to determine the proper exposure, whereas these are going to add that fall off area like we saw there just a moment ago on the evaluative metering process. You still have those surrounding rectangles that will take less importance in the overall process, but still play a role. But you'll notice with these, they're very limiting. So for example, the partial metering system, only 10% is evaluated. 10% of the overall image is evaluated. So while they're similar to the evaluative metering process in that they have a fall off area and they have a center, what's different is that they're going to ignore all the other information. All that black information you see there on the left, on the partial example, would not be taken into account. So it's only going to evaluate 10% of the overall frame. And that could be for certain situations where you're shooting on snow or you're shooting and you want to take an exposure meter reading off a very small subject that is different perhaps than in exposure terms than the rest of the frame, and you really want to slant the exposure towards that smaller part of the frame. That could be a good way to go. Center weighted is going to have perhaps less of a strict process when it comes to determining what's going to be taken into account and what's not. So for example, it'll then prioritize the center. It'll have a fall off region, but that fall off region will most likely be larger than the small 10% that we see on partial. So it's a more forgiving process than partial, but at the same time, it has similar characteristics in that it usually uses the center of the frame to determine exposure. Finally, spot metering systems just use 3% of the overall frame. They use the very center there, and that's it. So that gray area you see there in the middle of the frame would be all that's used to determine the correct exposure for a particular image. So it's very exacting. It's for situations where you really want to use one particular part of the frame to determine exposure, and for people who know exactly what they want when it comes to determining the subject and determining proper exposure within the frame, might rely on spot metering for certain situations. Now let's go to the other extreme. Let's expose for the chick now. And notice how much darker it got already. Let's zoom in on that chick. And let's just refocus really quick. Okay, now that's the fur there. It's a little bit harder to pick up than it was the black bear. So let me just move over a little bit so you can see the rest of the chick. There we go. Now we can see it's in focus. You can see all the little fibers now are all present on that chick's fur. Everything is focused. But the exposure, of course, for the overall image is now so slanted towards the white areas that now we're getting differentiation between the chick's fur and the white background. But look how dark the elephant is, and the bear is so dark that it's basically silhouetted. It's so dark that you really can't even see what it is. So this just gives you some idea of what's going on with the light metering system inside your camera, whether you use spot metering or whether you use the full frame evaluative process, and then you zoom in with your zoom lens to restrict it to one particular part of the frame, or however you choose to meter your scene. Don't forget that you've always got the ability to use manual override. So if you are using an automatic exposure method of some sort, whether it's shutter priority, aperture priority, or full automatic, just realize that manual is always an option for you if you're not getting what you want from your metering system. But if there are ways in which you can get your metering system to more accurately evaluate what you think is the subject, then you might be off to much better results much faster. All right, let's change the subject now and talk a little bit about exposure overall. And here's an example of the bracketing process. So all of these images were taken at different f-stops, and these are full stops here. You can see going from 2.8 all the way to 32. So we have a pretty full range here of f-stops. in action, and you can see that most people, if the subject of the image is going to be the statue, then most people would probably pick f5.6 to be the correct exposure. However, again, can be a subjective process, so other people may want it a little bit darker, a bit lighter. But here you can see clearly under and overexposed examples of the photographs. So I think it's pretty clear that most people would consider 2.8 to be overexposed. You see there's very little detail at all in the statue, in the texture of the statue. The wood below the statue is completely washed out, so it's almost white. And in terms of underexposure, we can look to f11 or f16 and beyond to see just how dark things can get and just how little of that image is usable when it comes to the value scale. And we see that how dark that background gets, but then again also how dark the subject is, and that's what really matters. That statue is so dark that we really don't have hardly any texture to look at. And the wood on f11, while that's got a nice rich brown tone that we could possibly use, the floor is not the subject, so that's really not the critical area that we're concerned with if this is going to be, we have to choose one of these photos. But certainly that data could be valuable in other ways if we consider HDR photography down the road. But anyway, as you look at these images side by side, here you get a sense of what can happen when you bracket exposure. And some photographers will do this, probably not to this extreme, but when they just want to have a sampling of different values correctly exposed, they might do something like this. So while 2.8 is not good for the statue, it is very good when it comes to the background. You notice this is the only image here that captures the green leaves there in the background, while f16 and f11 do a pretty good job of capturing that sun-drenched flooring. Here's a closer inspection, and here you can see that 5.6 really is the best overall exposure, but then the overexposed version of 2.8 and the underexposed version of f11 all have some valuable information in them. So now look at the wood flooring that I was mentioning earlier, and you see the rich wood tones that f5.6 doesn't have. The statue, yes, is too dark for most people's taste, but the flooring is not. Now, and look at f2.8, and again, look at the background there. You'll see that the leaves and the background furniture there are well exposed. Now, that's not the focus of the subject, or focus of the photograph, so it's, again, not what we would normally consider important, but at the same time, if we're going to use this information for an HDR photograph, that could be something that could definitely be valuable to us. But again, you'll notice the subject is overexposed in this case. So there are different file formats that are capable of capturing different color depths. And the JPEG file format is the one that most cameras, most every digital camera can shoot. This is an 8-bit color depth image, and it's the least forgiving when it comes to the tonal range of the photograph. RAW photographs typically have between 12 and 14-bit color depth, although that is getting higher and higher as we go forward in time. But they can capture more exposure range in a single image than a JPEG can. Now, the ultimate when it comes to exposure range would be the HDR image, and that's a 32-bit color range. And that requires that we take a series of images and then combine them into one to capture that wide tonal range. So that's kind of what I've been alluding to in looking at these exposure bracketing process. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's a JPEG at 8 bits. And you can see while this is a correctly exposed photograph, there are details missing there in the highlights. And this may not be important, but it may be of concern in certain situations, and it may not give the image a certain richness that it could possibly have. So if we look there at the center of the image, this is a center weighted image there when it comes to the subject, you'll notice that the stem and the left side are really blown out when it comes to that fuzzy texture there that exists on the surface of the plant. Now let's take a look at a raw version of the same photo. Now here we have a more expanded color depth. We have more rich tonal values throughout the frame, but notice particularly there the subject. You notice now look at the stem. Now look at the left side of that plant. And you notice those details have been filled in significantly with the expanded color range. Now let's take a look at the 32-bit version. There on the right, you can see the 3 photos that went into compiling this image. So you have a middle exposure or correct exposure for the subject. You have an underexposed image and an overexposed image to capture the rest of the details. And then combined, this is what can happen when you stick all 3 of these together and use some sort of HDR digital process. So let's compare these close up, and here's the raw versus the HDR, because it may not be readily apparent unless you put them side by side, but here you can see just a subtle difference there between the raw image and the HDR version. You'll notice that the HDR is just richer. Notice, look at the color in the purple there, and the veins and the leaves, look how they pop and stand out. And when you take an HDR image, you're able to capture the best of all 3 exposures. You're able to get the nice rich details in the shadows and the highlights, as well as the correctly exposed areas, and the subject really pops and you get all kinds of detail that you couldn't normally capture.